Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending Improving's July 10th virtual Lunch and Learn. Before we start, I want to inform you about a feature in the presentation that'll make the session more interactive. Please make note of the question mark icon at the upper right of the presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the question and answer feature, which allows you to send the moderator questions to be delivered to our insightful presenter at the appropriate time. Speaking of insightful presenters, I am proud to present Marcus King, who's a Director of Consulting at Improving. Today, Marcus will be sharing part one of a two-part series titled Business-Minded Architecture, How to Architect Solutions with Business Objectives Front of Mind. The floor is all yours, Marcus.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for spending some of your lunch with me. I really appreciate it. I joined Improving about 6.5 years ago or so, and really have had a great opportunity to architect solutions for some larger companies and smaller companies alike, and have seen quite a few different things. And what I've noticed over time is really, in order to architect the right solution for the right client, you have to have their business objectives front of mind as you step through this process. So just a little bit about myself. I am a director of consulting. I used to live in the Las Vegas area, started as a network and systems engineer, and then kind of naturally progressed into software engineering, and joined Improving a while back, and have really gotten to do a lot of different things for a lot of different clients. So when I kind of start this process and do these things, I really love to watch the teams grow, watch the business, and watch the technical side of the house really come together and spend some time talking about some things that maybe sometimes both sides think they understand or think they know. And then as you start to have these conversations and start to really dive down deep into some of these topics, you very quickly realize that some things aren't quite as well understood as maybe you thought they were. So we kind of always start with questions that I like to ask myself before I even get to a whiteboard. Before I have conversations with other people, I like to kind of dive down in and just annotate and make some notes for myself. And so the first one of these is who. I really want to know, who am I building this for, right? Are these internal users or are these external users? And I think that's an important question to ask. So you have an idea in mind of what the expectations are of who you're building this solution for. The next question I like to ask is what? And so what is it we'll be building? And we kind of get into this a little bit later. This is the main topic of this talk. And so we'll dive into that. And then the next one is when. And so when does this thing need to be out in production? Is this a minimum viable product, minimum marketable product or feature? When does the business expect this, and when does this even start? Great questions to ask. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of I guess the words are escaping me, but that's always not as clear as you might think it is. It's really great when it is, though. Next question is, why are we building this, and to what extent are we building this? And so we really want to know, what is the purpose behind what we're building. Context building for developers really helps shape what they're going to do as they're in the code and building out a system that you've laid forth for them to go do. And I think it's really important to understand that context before you start the project and not halfway through it. So to the what extent part, this is how far do we need to take this, right? Do we need to have every single feature in here? What is good enough? Let's define that first. If we were still waiting on Microsoft to put out the perfect version of Windows, we'd all still be waiting and using some other system. So it's really important that we understand exactly how far to take our design and when the design has met the expectations of our business and what is good enough for them and what might be considered gold plating, right? We don't want to gold plate if not necessary. So before you get to the whiteboard, you really want to start asking some other questions, and really it comes down to what the system is you're building, and that's the big block in the middle that you see. as well as what the inputs are into the system and what the outputs are. So I'm going to use in building an e-commerce platform a lot through this talk. And I'm going to kind of dive into, inputs and outputs as it might, have that in mind. But every system has inputs, every system has outputs, and really you can have multiple inputs that make one output or one input that makes many outputs. The point is it's overall boiled down to something pretty simple. I put in a purchase and that creates an order that gets fulfilled, and then that fulfillment goes outbound to our customer. So what I've done here is, and this is I think a really fun kind of thing. So we're going to dive into some things on here, but what I want to point out is we have inputs on the left on the x-axis and outputs on the right. And then splitting that are quantitative versus qualitative aspects of a design, where the quantitative things are really things we can measure, right? Those are your performance usage, things like that. We know exactly maybe what they want. Sometimes these are gray areas. This is a bit of a sliding scale. And then the qualitative are these kind of wide-ranging topics, things that we know are important, but we might not be able to really measure them, right? What does success look like in this topic? And that's not always necessarily clear, although sometimes it can be. Especially if you have conversations around them. So let's dive into this. I'm going to show you, after we've gone through all these topics, what this can create. I think it's a great artifact to have as you're going through the design process. So the first things are availability, data, performance, and usage. And so each of these, I'll dive into some of them a little bit more. And if you guys have questions during this, please ask. I'd love to hear them. I'm usually doing this in person, or I love to talk to people. And view these as more of a conversation. So as I'm talking about these, if you have questions, ask, and I'll try to answer as best I can. So what do I mean by availability? How often do we expect the system to be fully functional per week, right? Is there downtime? Is there not downtime? I used to work in the casino industry, and I used to work for a slot manufacturer. Slot machines make the majority of their money late at night, well into the early hours of the morning. So what we tried to do was take these systems down between about 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., which you would almost never want to do in a traditional, web platform or a traditional design that you're doing. You kind of plan for outages to be like 2 a.m., 3 a.m. You don't want to do that in a casino. That's really bad. So that's definitely a conversation you need to have, is what does downtime look like, if any? When can I service my system, and how is that going to impact your design? Questions like this are great to have ready, and it's great for a business person to think about that, because ultimately it's up to them to decide that. Next up is performance and usage. So performance, let's take like web pages, e-commerce platform. When that first landing page hits the browser, how fast do you expect it to be fully rendered, right? What are the expectations of number of concurrent users on your system? These are things that need to be understood and often are not. I used to be surprised at that question. I would ask it and not many people would have, an answer, and I would be really surprised by that. Nowadays, having done this a few times, I'm not shocked by people not necessarily understanding that, especially if it's a super new system or a whole new feature set within maybe an existing design that's already out there. So as you ask these questions, they might not always have the right answer. And so I always back into these. I say, okay, well, so if you don't know how many concurrent users, or you don't know kind of the load you expect, what do your sales numbers look like today? How many orders are you processing today? Well, maybe I'm processing 100,000 orders. Okay, great. How long does it take for somebody to get through the system? Do you have any Google Analytics we can go look at or dive down into? But that will help give you an idea as to what scale you need your application to really hit, right? What's that sweet spot look like? And then the last one in here is data. Data is also really important. I tried to design for about 3 years worth of data and like in a greenfield project where the client wouldn't have to necessarily upgrade to a bigger SQL system. Obviously, with cloud technology these days, that's really simple. Not everybody has the luxury of being in the cloud, and actually some really large companies often have their own data centers where they're responsible for what appears to be a cloud system, but is actually fully owned by the organization. So knowing what kind of server, the kind of horsepower it needs to have, and the kind of data they expect. I had a client where we built them, designed them a system, and it was growing at about 100 gig a week. And so we needed to plan for that because they also had their own servers. And so that was something we needed to account for in the design of our system and make sure that we did have the necessary storage capacity for the system we were building. So the next things and legal, lifetime, environment, security, integrations. Let me tackle kind of lifetime and environments first. So for lifetimes, what's the lifetime of this application or this design? Are we building something to combine two systems together as we migrate data from one side to the other? How long is that migration even going to last? Lifetime is normally thought to be in perpetuity, but rarely is. Usually it's 3 to 5 years, and then systems kind of start to become archaic and considered legacy. And so then at that point, we want to rewrite it or move on to a different platform. I have a background as a .NET engineer, so oftentimes you would see people in the late aughts, early 10s, move on to the Microsoft MVC platform. And then as UI frameworks, front-end frameworks became more widely available, Angular and React, you saw people wanting to migrate their MVC framework applications over into Angular or some other kind of application like that or framework like that. So the lifetime is super important. The other thing is environments. Most companies have at least 2 to 3 environments: a production environment, always a development environment. If you're doing it right, you probably have a staging environment where it's either meant for QA or your business users to go in and test a more stable release of your application. And then as you grow, you might need multiple staging or multiple QA environments, and where you're just testing one feature at a time, and then tearing that environment down, or maybe leaving it up and refreshing it with some software, with some newer versions of your software. Really important to have this discussion. If you need a new environment or the environments that you currently have are pegged, conversations in this realm will bubble those up to the surface, and maybe you need to buy new hardware, maybe you need to ramp up your cloud budget, whatever that might look like. But it's really important that you have those conversations and that's well understood. Oftentimes, really brand new systems and greenfield will involve new environments, and sometimes the business doesn't necessarily understand that. They think you're going to reuse whatever's there, and that's not always doable. So let's go over to the legal and integrations. Actually, let's tackle security first. So security is pretty simplistic. You need single sign-on, things of that nature. Nothing really, wowing here. Is this an LDAP integration with Windows authentication behind it? What does security look like? Two-factor authentication, those kind of conversations. But then it's the legal and the integrations kind of go hand in hand here, right? So for legal, are we storing pictures of people? Is that important? Should those be publicly accessible on, say, a CDN, or do they need to be behind some kind of gateway where we can check to make sure the person requesting that image can actually view that image, or is it outside the bounds of what they're allowed to see? And so that kind of also dovetails into integrations of, if you've ever built an e-commerce platform, PCI, do I really want to store credit cards? Do I really want to have healthcare patients' information, first name, last address, those PII, personally identifiable information? Is that something that I want to have in my network, and do I want to have data at rest with those concerns in place? A lot of times, especially for smaller, more mid-sized organizations, the answer is going to be no. right? If you're taking a credit card, you want to be able to show that you aren't storing that credit card anywhere. You don't want to have to go through PCI compliancy. That's really painful. And so that's what I mean by legal. And then the integrations part is, so if we do have a legal concern, how do we mitigate that risk? What is it we need to do to make sure that we are not in the way of being sued at some point in time? Or if something were to come down, we can go to somebody else and say, hey, we tasked you with this responsibility, and now we can hold them legally liable as well. Conversations like this are usually never fun to have, but they do need to be had. And it will bubble up maybe some key integrations that need to take place, whether they're a billing partner, payment gateway, healthcare provider, healthcare data provider, things of that nature. So once you've had all these conversations, we kind of get to the outputs, right? That was all of the inputs and all of the things that go into the system and into the design as we're thinking about how we're going to build what we're going to build. But then on the output of that, we have these outputs, and there's not nearly as many outputs, but for the conversation's sake. But you know, the first two here are going to be auditing and reporting, and they go hand in hand. But let's just tackle auditing first. The auditing is, how easy is it for you to account that your system did what you think it's going to do, and how can you show somebody else externally that it did exactly what you said it was going to do? If you've ever worked for or done work for a publicly traded company, you know auditing, especially around financials, is really big. And so you want to make sure that if your system is doing anything that might affect financials, you have a good audit trail within your system to show that you're in compliance with whatever you know, compliancy agency you need to be you know, adhered to. The reporting is also really big. So this is going to be a super interesting conversation if you've ever needed to have it. Usually it's not well understood, especially on these newer systems. You know, what KPIs, what key performance indicators does your business need to have to know that your design and to know that the applications that you've put out there are successful? You know, do they need to know sales by day? Is that good enough? You know, is that enough information for them to be able to make sound business decisions moving forward? Or they need to know sales by the hour, or even real-time sales, right? Those kind of conversations will let you know, maybe you need a data warehousing strategy to get that information out to them in a timely manner. You know, you generally don't want to tax your transactional systems for reporting data, and especially during peak business hours. That's generally considered not a good idea. And so to really understand the reporting that's needed by your executive staff is super important. And if you don't understand that, and then you're trying to determine what those reports are after the fact, you've probably set yourself up where the business doesn't trust you. And at the end of the day, as improving as spouses, it's all about building trust between you and your business partners that you're dealing with. So here's where this kind of becomes super cool. I'm sorry, I got two more things. So support and compliancy, this is the compliancy conversation is the other side of the legal conversation you've had. So do we have legal concerns as an input is super important. And then what does that mean in terms of compliancy on the output? And I've kind of already hinted at this. Right? Do we need to be HIPAA compliant? Is that important? Do we need to have PCI compliancy? And you know, how are we going to show that? The fun conversation here on these two is the support conversation of who is going to support this design, who's going to support these features or this application once it's out in the wild in production. I've sat in boardrooms where I've had this conversation with executives, and the executive who had support underneath him and the VP of software development, both of them disagreed who's going to be supporting the application once it went out in production. And that was a really fun thing to kind of see them talk through it. It was a friendly conversation, but it was definitely a fun conversation to see them talk through who was going to own this once it went out into production. And is it the development staff or, you know, someone else? You know, because if I'm building this, and then I'm not going to support it, or if I'm not even the one who's building my design and then it gets handed off, I'm three parties removed after it gets supported, so my design has probably been skewed somewhat, and I'm not going to be able to speak to the support as well as I would have if I was mainly in control of it. So these are really important conversations to have, but we're not done yet. This is where it gets really, really fun. So we can take this, right, and we have these inputs and outputs, and this is all kind of sliding scale stuff. You guys can put this stuff, you guys and girls can put this stuff wherever you want on this diagram. After you're done and you've had these conversations, it'll give you an idea of how important some of these are over other things, and it will let you create a heat map. Now you can keep this heat map and scale it up and down as needed as the project goes on, but it really allows you to visualize, whether you share this with others or not, what was important to the business and what wasn't. So you can frame conversations as you get into the design, and as you start to have to make conversations one way or the other, you can say, you know what, support was really important to the executive staff, and that meant a lot, and so is performance, because we expect this to really, you know, triple or quadruple or, you know, give a 500x boost to sales. And so we expect a lot of effort and a lot of energy put into that. Integrations, we don't really care about. Auditing, we got that covered, don't worry about it. And the lifetime in perpetuity, right? I don't see me replacing this for a while. So just build it as if it's going to be out there for a long time, please. And you know, you can scale this, and then, like I said, you can move it around if you need to, but it's a really, really, really fun thing to do here as you're going through these conversations, to understand and then visualize and then share exactly what everybody thought was important, and then you can go back and revisit this as the project continues, as I already said. So let's move on, right? I want to just, as we kind of move through the before the whiteboard phase into the to the whiteboard phase, I just wanted to make sure and take notice, we haven't designed anything yet. I haven't hit a whiteboard, I haven't opened up a marker, and I haven't actually started drawing or thinking any actual design through. We haven't had a lot of conversations and haven't had a lot of conversations in regards to what the actual design may look like and technologies we may pick. We're just having conversations with the business right now, trying to understand what it is they actually want built. And so why is this important? It's important for two reasons. You know, first, super important to understand exactly what they want, and to build trust with the organization that you are designing this for within your larger organization, department, as it were. So once you've done that and everybody's on the same page, it lets you move in to the whiteboard phase and really have a good grasp on what it is you're going to be designing and what is necessary and what isn't. So as I hit the whiteboard and I start going through teams with what we want and maybe what we don't want, it's super important to understand here that there's a simplicity versus complexity argument to be had. And so on the x-axis here, you see simplicity and complexity, whereas the complexity grows, you know, as you kind of move more to the right, to the left. And then cost goes up right on that y-axis. And so what I've done here is the system is this parabola you have in front of you. And so what I'm conveying in this graph here is that if your system is too simple, your cost goes up. I think we've all been here. I'm going to explain some things that how do you know you're here? Well, I'll get into that. And then also on the other side of this is as your complexity goes up unnecessarily, your costs go up. And so you know, if your complexity is rising and it's not necessary, what you wind up doing is increasing your cost for no reason. So you're spending money that you could have put elsewhere. So how do I know I'm at this aspect of the graph, right? How do I know that I've had a system that's too simple? I've backed myself into a corner that is really difficult to get out of. Some of the key things that I see when a system is kind of drowning in simplicity is that you're spending all your time resolving things that you think or you know you could have automated if given the time. If you had built features for others and taking the time to do that, you wouldn't be in the database maybe updating a transactional system against live data. Never a good place to be, and if that's where you find yourself, you probably don't have enough complexity in your system, and you needed to get a little bit more complexity in your system to be able to really achieve the goal that you wanted to achieve. Now, how do you know that you are on this side of the parabola, right? How do you know that your system is too complex? And this, I see this a lot as well. One way to really know that you're here is you are constantly tasked with finding out how something got into a state that it was in and not understanding how that occurred. So I see this often where, you know, maybe a sale went into your e-commerce platform and the order is showing as being fulfilled even though there hasn't been a payment on it yet. How did that happen? I don't even know. That should never happen. If you hear yourself or someone else say that should not even be possible, you probably have driven way too much complexity into your system to be able to wrap your head around it. And that's really not a very good place to be. So where you want to be is this 90-10 rule. You want to be right here. You want to hit this sweet spot where your system is really simple enough to understand and can be maintained by most people, those mid-level to senior level engineers who can come in, you can quickly show them the applications you've built, you can quickly have them download the code repository, they can hit F5 or whatever, you know, to launch the application. They can start wrapping their heads around what the application is doing. 10% of your system, however, 10% of your system can be a little bit more complex, right? You need those super senior people, those heroes within your organization to come in and really spell out exactly what may be needed to resolve a solution. And you know, why not go that extra 10%? Why not try to drive down the cost just a little bit more? Well, the reason is simple. If you find yourself trying to drive that cost, trying to drive that extra 10% to get, you know, simple yet elegant, and you try to go too much to the elegant side, you wind up missing the trough and coming right back up on the other side. And this goes up very fast. The more complex your system gets, this is not something that kind of does this, right? It's very, very narrow here. And so it's really difficult to hit just that right area of enough simplicity, but yet enough elegant design. So you can make sure that you are driving as much business value into what you're trying to output to make sure you're getting the best return on your investment.
Hi, Marcus. We have one question from the audience.
Sure.
What tools do you use for heat mapping?
What tools do I use? Oh, for that heat map? That was just a SharePoint. I just do that in SharePoint. So I used to have a spreadsheet where I would kind of keep all these things in mind, and then I would try to. I like really simple tools. So I would use Excel and then try to, you know, put numbers to them just so I could keep it in my head. And that I never really shared those. That was just something for me to keep in the back of my head. The issue with it is it's not terribly presentable. I can't really show that to somebody. They're not going to be wowed by a spreadsheet with some numbers on it. So that's what made me use Excel here. But I really prefer low fidelity tools for things like this because I want a low barrier to entry. If somebody wanted to change something, I don't want to have to train somebody to use that tool for a heat map, such as what I was showing. I just want them to be able to open up PowerPoint or you know, whatever and just make a quick change on shape and call it a day. So that's how I do it. Excel would be another easy tool to do. Does that answer your question? Hopefully. So next up, we have, as we're going through our design and we're on the whiteboard and we're talking to teams, we really need to understand buy versus build. I think it's super important, and I'm not going to read off all of these things here. Everybody's capable of reading, I think. But what I really wanted to point out here is cookie cutter critical systems and difficult to build. So a lot of organizations, sometimes their engineers want to build everything. And my example back to that is you're not building a word processor for your internal users to create Word documents. You just go out and buy, your Office suite, Office 365 or whatever, and let them use those tools to produce presentations and Excel spreadsheets and whatever. Anything that's kind of ubiquitous. Another great example would be single sign-on. I can't tell you how many login screens I've had to build in my career, in my almost 20 years of doing this. It's kind of ridiculous, to be honest with you. There's great single sign-on tools out there. Auth0 is one I've used. It's fantastic. It's not a lot of code to you, and they take care of a lot of the things that you would normally have to go out and build. And frankly, it can be difficult to build for kind of your return on your investment here. Sometimes you do want to build, and the thing I want to point out here is the legacy or compliancy concerns that I have down here. I've seen, I want to buy a piece of software to mitigate my risk around credit card fraud or around, patient information. I've seen the exact same conversation wind up. Well, no, we need to build it to make sure we have full control, right? Or we need to build it to make sure that we really understand what's going on. And it's that unrestricted behavioral control versus restricted behavioral control. If the behavior is well understood by the majority of your users, and it doesn't really ever change very much. SharePoint's another great example of, if I just need a repository to throw some files in and just kind of keep track of all those, sure, you could build it, but there's SharePoint and a ton of other document management systems out there. Those companies have invested time and money into those tools and can probably sell it to you for far cheaper than you can build it for. And so it's really important that you take all that into consideration. And those answers aren't always necessarily as clear as you may think. And the more you get a chance to do these kinds of architectural exercises, you're going to see where sometimes it's really advantageous for you to buy a piece of software and not build it, because it gives you some wiggle room here to say, hey, if something were to go wrong in this space, I'm not legally liable for this. This person is, and that can help your organization out as they understand exactly where they are liable or may not be liable with whatever it is that's out there in a production environment. So kind of the next thing we need to figure out here is, the on-prem versus cloud conversation. Now, this is a conversation that's been going on for a very long time, and until everybody is in a ubiquitous cloud environment, we will continue having this conversation. And like I had pointed out really early on in this talk, in the first couple of slides, most people are in and on the cloud, or they're trying to get to the cloud. It's not always as cut and dry, though. I've had a client where they had a bit of code that needed to run out and just fetch some data every once in a while. And if they were to run that as a Lambda expression, they would have spent vastly more money than if they were to host it themselves on their own premise, in their own data center. And so they chose to not put that in the cloud due to a cost concern. And so while everybody wants to move up and they want to run Azure Functions, or they want to go serverless and they want to run a Lambda expression, and I'm all for it. I love cloud. I love Azure, especially, and AWS. It's not always the right choice. And so to understand what needs to live where and when it's appropriate for you to maybe put this in a data center that your company owns, or say, we're going to pull this over and move it into another space, really important. And the last thing about the on-prem conversation here is offline access. I had a client that used to store data every day. They had people calling for some data, and then they would store this data. Offline access was absolutely key to their success as an organization, meaning if they were to host it in the cloud, those applications in the cloud, and then they were to lose internet connectivity even for an hour or two, that would have huge impact to their revenue stream, which was something that was just not a risk they were willing to take. So we had to build some of the applications that were responsible for capturing and aggregating this data, and really have it hosted locally for that business to be able to consume. So as we start to wrap up here, and these are some of the last little takeaways that I put into my designs, is I try to pick languages, frameworks, technologies that your organization are ready to take on and support. This is also known just colloquially as resume-driven development. I've always wanted to work with pick technology here. And so, I have a chance to design something, so I'm going to go pick this obscure language because I've always wanted to build in it. That's really cool, and I love pushing the envelope, and I push the envelope all the time. You have to ask yourself, am I pushing the envelope in the right place? Maybe there's a few different things you want to pick up. Maybe you've never done React, and so this is your chance to pick up React. The reason why this is so important, though, is if you pick technologies, and especially languages and frameworks, that your organization wasn't ready to take on, and then you, a few years later, a few months later, whatever the case may be, and you decide to take another position somewhere else, you've now left that organization in a really hard spot to hire to support something that you were supporting. You always want to leave something better off than you found it. And so to me, I try to pick languages and I try to pick frameworks and technologies that give the organization the largest applicant pool. So if they need to ramp up, they aren't having a hard time finding individuals who can support the technologies that they have out in production. If something is needing an update and you're spending 2 months just trying to find somebody, you probably don't have a good technology choice in that spot. And so really think about that, and when you do push the envelope, where are you pushing it, how are you pushing it, and where are you going to leave your organization out on a ledge after you're done pushing that thing out to production. Secondly, here, you got to stand up your CI/CD pipeline first, or modify it first. One of your very first demos, if that's the kind of organization you're in, show your CI/CD pipeline working. Show you making a change and push it out. Don't do your demo on local hosts unless you absolutely have to. Show it working in a development environment or in a staging environment where you can see that process is working. That will become key, because once you get really close to go live, or after it just went live and you're trying just to button up whatever loose ends might be there, that ability to push quickly is going to be key to you being able to pivot whenever something may go wrong for you. And then the last thing here that's worth mentioning is the beginning of execution of automated testing, and that testing pyramid and what your testing strategy is going to be. But start that immediately. So if this is greenfield, don't let your developers check in any code without a unit test on it, right? Or maybe an end-to-end test. Super important you keep that in mind, and that you explain to the business and you explain to them on the output of your whiteboard sessions and on the output of what you propose to do, that this testing strategy will build quality. These conversations are sometimes not met well, sometimes they are. I find the overall they're being met better than they were, say, 10 years ago. But it's really important that you start that practice early on when you're building new features, or you're building a brand new platform. You really want to make sure that you have that testing strategy down and that it's well documented, so your development staff can get started on it and understand what's required to be successful within the project. So here we are. We're on the we've kind of had all these great conversations, right? We've asked the business all these great questions. We've built trust with them. We're all on the same page. We went to the whiteboard with our teams. We started whiteboarding out some things. We even know what we're going to buy. We even know what we're going to build. We think we know some of it's going to be, maybe on-prem, but most of it's going to be in the cloud. We have a strategy for how to do that. Now you kind of have to sell this thing, right? You have to go back into your boss's office, into a boardroom, or up to the C-level's office, C-level suite, sorry, and you have to explain to them why this is the design that's going to work. And what does that mean? And so that's an entirely different conversation apart from this. And so how to sell that is actually going to be the topic of my next talk. And so in 2 weeks, I will come back and I will briefly go over everything we went over in this talk. And then I will kind of get more into the, how do I go about my audience and selling this design to make sure that all the time and effort, blood, sweat, and tears that you've put into this are for naught. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. And if you guys have any questions, I would love to hear them.
Thank you all for attending today's virtual lunch and learn. Marcus, thank you for sharing business-minded architecture, how to architect solutions with business objectives front of mind. The recording of the session will be available the next business day. To view the recording, locate the session from Improving's virtual events page. While you're on the virtual events page, be sure to register for future lunch and learn sessions. Next Friday, we have a session titled Taking Power BI to the Next Level. And in 2 weeks, we have part 2 of Marcus's webinar on business-minded architecture. Thank you all very much.